You remember Din Ben Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rifle. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on them.
Hello and welcome to Guerrilla History, the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm your host, Henry Hakamaki, joined by one of my co-hosts for a very impromptu, unplanned, unscripted episode, which hopefully we'll see how it comes out. I'm joined by Professor Adnan Husain, historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Hello, Adnan. How are you doing?
I'm well, Henry. It's great to be back with you. I'm sorry I missed the last episode. It was a great one. But we're going to do some free-form chatting today, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, this is the Guerrilla History version. I wish this was Rev Left. This is the Guerrilla History version of free-form jazz, really, because we had showed up for recording one topic, and for a certain reason, we're not able to record about that topic right now. And so we just decided on the fly that we would talk about something completely unrelated, which I am absolutely unprepared for. But fortunately, Adnan, you will be able to teach me along with the audience. So what are we going to be talking about today during this episode?
Well, Henry, I want to talk just a little bit, perhaps, about a figure from the 14th, early 15th century North Africa, who was a pretty profound historical and social thinker that most people will not have heard of, named Ibn Khaldun. His full name was Abu Zayd Abdurrahman ibn Muhammad ibn Khaldun al-Hadrami, and he died in 1406. And you can find, for example, a statue of him if you're in Tunis, downtown in front of the French embassy. There's a really interesting statue. He's facing the French embassy. And he's a celebrated figure who was kind of discovered in some ways in the 18th, 19th centuries. His work, although he wrote obviously in the 14th and early 15th centuries, may not have been, much consulted, but he's the author until, more modern times. But he's the author of a really remarkable work of history. It's a kind of universal chronicle, focuses a lot more on North Africa and the Middle East, but there was a genre and a tradition in the pre-modern world of these global or universal world histories that were written. Great empires want to celebrate themselves and situate their kind of dispensation or their sort of culture and civilization within some broader span, and they know about the Romans and the Persians, and they look to these prior precedents as a certain age of history into which they fit and are the new dispensation. And so every one of these major kind of big, profound cultural turns generates these kinds of forms of writing. That's also the case, of course, in the Islamic world, where there were many universal chroniclers and universalist historians writing, particularly in the era of the Abbasid period when the caliphs ruled in Baghdad, a vast world empire that was the largest of its time as a land-based empire until the Mongol invasions of the 13th century and the Mongol world empire of the 13th century. And it stretched, the Abbasid Empire stretched from basically what is today Morocco, so the Atlantic, all the way into Central Asia, beyond the, Oxus and Jaxartes rivers, and parts of what is today, Persia, Afghanistan, a bit of North India, perhaps, and between. So and from in the north, it was on the borders with Anatolia, and to its south, the Yemen and, parts of North Africa. And so it was this global, really large-scale Afro-Eurasian empire. And so there were historians who thought this was universalist in scope, and they wrote these kind of histories of the world, all culminating, of course, with the formation of this new empire and this new age. Ibn Khaldun is writing several centuries later, at a period where there had been some more fragmentation and localization. It no longer was the Abbasid Empire integral and whole and ruled by a caliph in Baghdad, but there had been many regional formations. And what had happened in North Africa, which is where he was from, is that there had been successive waves of various movements that had incorporated the Berber tribes people of indigenous to North Africa. I mean, we shouldn't really even call them Berber. This is just the old language that was used for the indigenous peoples of North Africa, but the Amazigh and others, these indigenous figures in the Atlas Mountains and so on, were tribal formations that became Islamized and themselves became important progenitors and founders of new dynastic states in the region. Sometimes they conquered parts of Spain, but they definitely integrated most of what we call the Maghrib, that is basically from Libya, Tunisia to Morocco. And Ibn Khaldun was himself an administrator, somebody who worked in government, who had experience of working with then the Hafsid state, and which was centered in what is modern day Tunisia, but governed parts of Libya and Algeria at its height. And he was, intimately involved with managing, in particular, relationships with tribal groupings that had been the foundation of the Almohad state. That is the Al-Muwahidun, a movement that emerged in the 12th century, had a kind of religious ideology, but was built upon these tribes folk of the Atlas Mountains and established a dynasty, and a polity, a state in most of North Africa. And this Hafsid state was a sort of successor state in the 13th and early 14th centuries, and he worked within it, and he was part of partisan politics, and there were factions and so on. And at a certain point, he was sort of on the outs, politically speaking, and he lost sort of his government position, and he retired to a kind of small town area and decided to write this monumental work of history. But interestingly, before getting into the actual retelling of events and successive dynastic movements and placing them within the context of larger Islamic and other civilizations, he felt that it was important to have some kind of a methodological statement. And that work, the introduction, al-Muqaddimah, and that's what it means in Arabic, is the introduction. The introduction to his Universal Chronicle has become a classic of historical theory, to the extent that he is sometimes called the father of sociology, or the father of, the social sciences. And so that's why he's kind of significant and important. And I've been thinking a little bit about this question of the relationship between history and the social sciences. If people are interested in becoming a patron, they will find that recently I've been posting short little readings and discussions on the question of the relationship between history and social science by reading William H. Sewell Jr.'s Logics of History, Social Theory and Social Transformation, to kind of think about these methodological questions. This is very much an academic type work of thinking about, academic institutions and the formal professional study of history versus the anthropologists, sociologists, and political scientists and economists, and whether there is some kind of dialogue that could be established methodologically to help us understand social theory in a more fulfilling, historically dynamic way. And I would say this is what Marxists themselves actually have to be very concerned with, is how do we understand the structures of society and of domination, and how do we understand how social change and transformation takes place over the course of time. Somebody like Marx was a brilliant kind of historical materialist as well as a social scientist, and he was writing in a time when these disciplines were just starting to emerge as separate kinds of disciplines. And so if we were to rethink in our own age, what's the relationship between the insights that are coming from sociology, economics, political economy, anthropology with history, and the desire and hope for informed lessons of the past to see how transformation could take place in our age and in the future? This is a kind of interesting set of issues of how do you think of those in relationship to one another.
Yeah, I'm going to cut you off for just a second, Adnan, and let me address two things. The first thing, there was some beeping in the background, And I will let our listeners know that that is our other co-host, Breht O'Shea of Revolutionary Left Radio, who I forgot to introduce during the introduction of the show, but that's what the beeping is. So there's the shout out for Breht. We wish you were here, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing we always say when somebody's not here. The second thing is, man, Adnan, you are a real pro. We did not rehearse the questions that I was going to ask. I did not even know the topic of this discussion more than 10 minutes before we hit record. And yet the first three questions that I have written down, you addressed all three of them. So I'm just going, that's okay. I mean, like I said, you're a real pro. You knew exactly what I was going to be putting out there. But let me throw them out there anyway in the way that I was going to ask them, just in case there's something that you would like to add before we get into a little bit more of Ibn Khaldun's ideas themselves. So the first thing that I wanted to ask about, which again, you addressed at least in part, is what was the field of history and historiography like at this period of time that he was around. And again, you did talk a little bit about this, but if there's anything that you want to add, feel free. The second part, which again, you also addressed, was, we had kind of this monolithic historical narrative, or at least way of thinking about history at this time. And yet we have Ibn Khaldun breaking free of this. And I was just curious, what were the influences on him that would have allowed him to make this major break? Because, of course, this also goes along with, not having a great man of history kind of thinking. Like, these great ideas did not come out of nowhere. Like, it's not just like somebody was put down on earth from heaven one day and these great ideas came into their minds. Like, Marx did not come out of nowhere. Marx took the ideas of former thinkers like Hegel, for example. Ibn Khaldun was not placed on earth by some greater power either. So it's really interesting, like, what would have influenced him to have allowed him to make this major break from the established norm in terms of what we were thinking about history itself, as well as the methodology of history. Very interesting. And the third thing, which you only briefly mentioned, is you mentioned that his Universal Chronicle really became a seminal work. I'm wondering, were his ideas that he put forth widespread still during his life, or was this something that was really adopted afterwards? So that was my third question. And then we can kind of go into the ideas that were put forth in the Universal Chronicle and how they had changed the perception of history and the methodology of history. But yeah, those are my first 3 points. Or what was history and historiography like at the time? What influenced him? And were his ideas widespread during his life, or was it something that only came around either shortly after or way after he was dead?
Yeah, no, those are great questions, and I don't think I, really fully dealt with them. I might have glancingly touched on some of them. So it's really great that you pose them, because I think it's important for people to understand that while the historian's profession, had a long history of its own, in the sense that there are chronicles and written and preserved from antiquity. Of course, everyone is familiar with. Well, I don't know if everyone is, but, if you've heard of the discipline of history's sources in ancient Greek writing, in other kinds of chronicles from different societies and cultures in the ancient world, you would have heard of Herodotus, you would have heard of Thucydides, and so know that there is kind of the telling of stories. And in fact, in some ways, the telling of stories is itself has a whole long, history from the origins. People have told stories about themselves, and sometimes when we talk about epic, there is a sort of historic time. I mean, it's literary, but it's also meant to deal with a historical people. So this is definitely, something that has always, been there in settled culture and civilization. But when people actually went to write chronicles, what they would do, is kind of tell the story of the great figures. And usually they focus and center on political powers and political leaders and, kings and nobles and so on. That was, telling the story of, rule and rulership and their activities and retailing, narratives about them. And so that's what most of these kind of chronicles are about, is going through, about the rise of particular leaders with decisions that they made, challenges that they faced. And so one explanatory mode, if there is, more than just telling stories, is, kind of the moralizing historical, orientation. Good rulers mean justice and, things being flourishing, in that era, right? And it's usually put down to the fact that the ruler was a good ruler, a good person. They were wise. They had the right character and morals and intentions, right? And bad rulers introduced tyranny and oppression and raised taxes and caused wars and so on. And so it was about these great figures. And if anything, in terms of explanation, it might be about this moral kind of character core that is the engine for whether things will be good, whether there will be wars, etc., and so on. The other
allow me to butt in for 1 second, and sorry if I hope that this doesn't sidetrack you from everything else, but I'm curious also on this note how prevalent, or how prominent rather, religion and spirituality were within the existing mode of thinking, as well as within Ibn Khaldun's mode of thinking. Like, was this something that really was foundational and fundamental to either or both of these, or one more than the other? Or was this something that just kind of was ubiquitous at this time?
Well, I think you're right that's an excellent question. I mean, it was sort of ubiquitous that there are some presuppositions framing this if we're talking about Christian and Muslim pre-modern historians and chroniclers. They are presuming a kind of theology of history in some sense, that there's a divine hand in history, and so that's helping also possibly to explain things, or at least marking off new dispensations. And this is situating in the Muslim era, and that there was some kind of divine framework in which you would understand, human progress as, unfolding with more, guidance of, these different religious communities succeeding one another. And then now this is the age of the Muslim world. And so that's the kind of framework overall. And of course, one would also, think about questions like, predestination, and, whether things are preordained versus how they unfold with human decisions, and, how does God's will work itself out in history? So definitely there was a kind of theological backdrop. And I think somebody like Ibn Khaldun kind of presupposes that, but he kind of, interestingly enough, moves beyond either just retelling stories with no kind of explanatory framework or rationale, or, those who want to see a moral kind of question that might be even tied with, divine will and so on in everything. He kind of tries to bracket both of those and suggests that there are, human social forces that are explanatory for why certain groups come to dominate others, how states are formed, and on what basis, and why they, last only for as long as they do and are replaced by others. He was, positioned in North Africa and saw so many successive changes of different, tribal groupings coming together, seizing cities, and then, establishing a dynasty. But after 3, 4, 5 generations, kind of losing power to another group coming from the countryside, coming from, the harsh conditions where tribal, identity was the sole manner of subsistence and survival. And he decided, and so this is, kind of what distinguished him, is he actually had personal experience trying to manage sort of tribal policy for the Hafsid governors. So he spent time among these people, and he could see these people are ready to eat the lunch of these, sophisticates at the court, and who are now, enjoying the luxuries of urban civilization, who are totally unprepared for the warlike, kind of folk that are ready to come in. And so he was very impressed with the power that is created from from a military perspective by what he considered the harsh conditions of existence in the countryside, in the mountains, and in the wilderness, and that it bred people whose interdependence with one another was very strong. And I think that kind of an insight, that's something like maybe what an anthropologist would have about tribal solidarity and structures, he started to theorize that this was the basis for dynastic power, that it wasn't how large your military was versus, another army. It was this idea of asabiya, of group solidarity or group feeling. And the group, a particular group that had strong group feeling or strong asabiya, he felt always had a material and military advantage that would overwhelm those whose group feeling became more attenuated. And how did it become attenuated? Is when you settle in a city, you have the intermixing of peoples, you have greater interdependence of society and segmentation of, labor. He actually comes up with a theory, essentially, of a kind of social division of labor. That is how he analyzes, urban sociology. And he says urban sociology weakens those tribal affiliations where your consanguinity and all of that are very clear, and it disperses it in a broader population. And as a result, it's harder to mobilize people with strong group feeling together, and that ultimately over several generations, you end up having the weakening of the military base that exposes them to new groupings from the countryside who come in. And so this was kind of he combined a sense of urban sociology and political economy with a sense of anthropology and tribal relationships to understand how is the state formed and how is it kind of ruled and governed on this kind of life cycle of a dynastic kind of cycle. And that he thought was the engine of history. That's how you explain history and the rise and fall of political dynasties. So it was a kind of secular in some ways. I mean, it's interesting. He did sort of have a theory of how religion participates in this, but his theory was to think of religion as galvanizing and enhancing social bonds and relationships and giving a grouping a kind of ideological purpose. So he understood it in a kind of social scientific way of what function religion, it didn't think this is the sum total of religion, but what is the function, socially speaking, that a religious movement might play? And he thought that the strongest kind of forces were when you combine tribal asabiya in its more pure form coming from the countryside with a galvanizing religious ideology that intensified that sense of group feeling and gave it a kind of mission in history to achieve ideologically, that is when you have really long-lasting kinds of new dispensations. And that's how he located the origins of Muslim civilization, is that he said Muhammad combined, a kind of religious ideology with the Bedouin tribal kind of group solidarity, asabiya, to make a kind of super asabiya, super group solidarity that was able to establish a long-lasting kind of new culture and civilization that other groupings kind of had to work within the Islamic world once it had been created.
Well, you said he created this super asabiya, which it's really funny. I just unmuted myself to say he's almost thinking of this in the terms of it being a superstructure, right? In very much like, I don't want to say in Marxian terms, but in terms of the way that Marxists formulate base and superstructure, his formulation of religion fits pretty neatly within that. It's not the way that religion was thought to kind of supersede base and superstructure in the way that many of these other early historical and political theorists thought of it. I could be misreading it. I mean, feel free to disabuse me of that notion if I'm wrong, but the way that you explained it really did sound like thinking of it as in Marxian terms as part of the superstructure.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting analogy, because I think he is somebody who appreciates structural conditions. I mean, he wouldn't describe them in the same way that a modern social scientist would look at structures, but he's looking at social relations. He's looking at conditions that can be abstracted from the particularities of one society to another. So he has a kind of concept of something like urban society and what are the structures within it. And then he also has a kind of theory, or at least a sense of the relevance of culture and ideas and how they fit into it. And that's, of course, where he locates religion, and seeing the interplay between, as you were putting it, kind of superstructural culture and ideology and its relationship to, more kind of embedded, durable social structures. Except that, what's very interesting about him is that he's a theorist of change. So he's very historically inclined. He doesn't want to just describe kind of structures in society and study them in that manner. He's interested in their emergence and rise, and also what undermines them. So he's very interested in historical change. And in that fashion, I think he's like Marx, or I was reading William Sewell's Logics of History, is, he's interested in how do you understand and theorize social and political change. He does have quite a lot of substantial discussion of the division of labor and the interdependence of society as a result. He ends up, he agrees with and actually develops Aristotle's idea that, Aristotle said, humankind is a political animal, right? What Ibn Khaldun suggests is that it's a social animal. That is, that the interdependence of human life requires cooperation, requires affiliations and social relations, and that's what he's interested in studying, and how that progresses in and through history, of these bonds being created and how they are dissolved in order to explain change in history, political dynasties coming and going, and so on. So I think that's an important and good insight to think about it. One could think about it as the more complex readings that one would have of Marx and base and superstructure. Likewise, you can't isolate the two completely in Ibn Khaldun's thinking. There's a more sophisticated interrelationship between kind of these cultural forms, religious forms, what we would think of as ideological forms, and basic social structure and material kinds of conditions. But it's interesting. He's interested in explaining things. You take into account the material conditions. So he has one passage where he talks about victories in battle and how you have to think about this. It's terrain, it's like numbers, it's all these things. But he thinks you're missing out decisively on this other component if you don't take into account the social relations. And so in some ways you might say that he sort of socializes kind of Aristotle's, in trying to elevate history, or at least invent a form of study of history that would conform to what he thought of as a scientific or philosophical, science in the old sense of like a form of knowledge, and as a philosophical discipline. And maybe that's something that's worth mentioning is looking at the passage where he talks a little bit about Aristotle. But let me
that was tremendous, and I'm sorry for taking you on these diversions. I'll give you the opportunity now to go back to briefly talk about, if you want to expand on any of the original questions that I posed with regards to his influences, historiography at this time, and how widespread his ideas were. If there's anything that you want to add on that before we move on, because I know that I did sidetrack us pretty badly there.
Oh, no, not at all. That was stuff I definitely wanted to discuss about his thought. So they were definitely very useful questions and perceptive questions. Just all I would say about the reception is that while his work wasn't, a kind of classic, in its time that everybody read, the Muqaddimah and his universal history, nonetheless, like, his reputation succeeded him. Even during his lifetime, he was known as somebody who had claims anyway for how to understand progress of history and dynastic succession and power in the world through social means, the sort of secrets in some ways of history, what he himself calls the inner history that is behind just the the discussion of events that happen is like the causes of why things happen. That's what he thinks of as inner history. And, in this kind of culture, these are considered sort of exoteric and esoteric, that is surface or inner kinds of understanding. And so, to the extent that he had enough of a reputation that Tamerlane, as he's known in the West, great world conqueror of like the 14th and early 15th centuries, happened to be besieging Damascus. I think it was 1402, and Ibn Khaldun was in the city. He'd been sent on some kind of diplomatic mission or some kind of administrative mission. He happened to be, in the camp that opposed Timur, but he himself took the trouble of sneaking out, for an evening in order to have a famous meeting with Tamerlane, who was interested and had heard of him because he thought that Ibn Khaldun had worked on the question of what made dynasties, powerful and successful, and he, saw himself as a sort of world historical figure himself. And why wouldn't you if you ruled, a territory that stretched from Central Asia to Anatolia to Syria? And so he had a meeting with him. So it's clear that, his reputation as somebody who had a theory of power, was known at his time.
Yeah, super, super interesting stuff. There's a lot of threads that I could take here, but I guess the one that I'll take right now, that way we can talk a little bit more about his thoughts specifically, is that you mentioned that his work led him to be called the father of sociology. Mm-hmm. Can you take us through how and why that is the case? Like, why do people call him the father of sociology? What things did he do that would warrant such a title? And how are they big advancements over what was taking place prior to him? Like, why would this be the birth of a field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a great issue here. I think the reason one could sort of justly say that he was the progenitor of a different way of thinking, and an inventor in some ways of social science, is that because he made and had the aspiration to make a scientific or philosophical study of human society, that all the diversity, behind the diversity of forms of culture and social relations, he believed you could identify certain principles and almost what we might say as laws, normative kinds of theoretical conclusions that would be applicable across history and different societies and cultures. And that's essentially turning the study of society into a kind of scientific or philosophical discipline. Is that, are there, beyond just particulars, are there regular explanatory principles of human social interaction that help you explain the nature of social relations, the nature of social power, how social structures exist, and in other words, the forms that society takes, the particular forms? Can they be derived and understood as being related to some broader form of explanation? And that's what he was attempting to do. And he's, that's, I was alluding to, how he said that, that although Aristotle didn't recognize history because of it's just the study of particulars rather than of universals or general principles, that nonetheless human societies did have in his mind certain principles that could be identified through appropriate study. And that's what he endeavored to do. So what he did was kind of invent, in some ways, a rationalist approach to studying human society. And that's why he's sometimes credited with developing social science, sociology, and the different branches of the social sciences. But the idea that you could apply a kind of logical, reasoned approach to understanding society, that they weren't arbitrary differences. There weren't, just arbitrary particularities, that couldn't be explained. He thought you could explain them and endeavored to do so as a way to then study history and to be able to also determine what's true in history and what's not. Like, one of the kind of key problems of his time was that many of the historians he criticizes of his own age are people who will retell, stories that they can't verify, that have been transmitted, and they will uncritically retell them and include them. And he thought you have to be able to have a mechanism or a method for telling what could be true and what's not, what's fanciful. And how you needed a theory in order to do that. So one is, of course, a physical theory. Things that are impossible physically, of course, you would discount. But what about socially? Are there things that, socially speaking, you could say, are causal in society, that if somebody makes if somebody tells you an account of somebody's rule, that you could analyze and determine whether this is really a true report or not, whether it made sense or not, by judging it against sets of principles of what social action looks like, of what social relations might be. And so that's the way in which he was approaching his study of history, was through trying to figure out whether there were like inner laws or inner principles and guiding kinds of norms that could be identified.
Yeah, really interesting. So I understand that he was very, very influential, both shortly after his life, as well as, even now people are still reading him, although, as you kind of mentioned, maybe not as many people as we would like. I certainly haven't read him, so I'm not going to claim to be an authority on him or anything like that. Like I said, we really only discussed this for about 10 minutes before we hit record. So, yeah, what I want to ask now, and feel free to take your time or go on any routes that you want to take this with, because it's both specific, but there's a lot of things that you could say about it as well. A lot of different routes that you could take out of this. So, as we mentioned previously, nobody exists in isolation. We all draw ideas from other people. And as you mentioned, he was very influential, but I'm curious if there's anybody that would be considered to be like a Khaldunian or something along those lines, either shortly afterwards, or, what was there like a tendency that followed his line of thought that developed and were kind of affiliated with his ideas in the way that we have some of these other philosophical and political tendencies? Like, was there actually a movement that built out of this in terms of a way of thinking about it? Were there any prominent thinkers that would have fit this mold? And then the other part of this question, which is somewhat related, is looking today, a lot of his ideas would have been supplanted by now, right? This is, we take ideas, we adapt them, we advance them, and then we come up with new ideas based on those previous ideas. And this is a process that continues and continues and continues. And at the end, you may not even see much of the original material that you were basing your current ideas on, but through the iterations over decades and centuries of refining and advancing those ideas, the current way of thinking would not have been possible without having those previous ways of thinking, even if we don't really necessarily see the remnants of it. But on the other hand, we also have some ideas that have stood the test of time, like very explicitly. They were put forth in form X, and there's been minor modification to it, but they're very much the same. So is there anything that specifically has been taken that we can take from Ibn Khaldun as being useful for analyzing history today, analyzing the world around us today? Or are the ideas that he put forth that were so prominent and so useful at the time, are these things that were very useful at the time, but have been advanced to the point by now that we don't really see the explicit form that he put them forth in, but really we're just kind of continue building on these ideas as the fundamental building blocks that we no longer see, the foundation of the building?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a little bit more the latter, in the sense that, one, there wasn't like a sort of school of Ibn Khaldunian history that emerged and then had continuities to the modern day. He's sort of somebody who stands somewhat alone in that he developed this approach, but it wasn't necessarily continued in the precise sort of way in which he developed it was more rediscovered later, and people found inspiration and saw connections with new kinds of thinking that were emerging in scholarship in these emerging social sciences in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so in lots of ways, of course, his particular insights, have been developed further, or other kinds of theories. I mean, he's not somebody who stands for current kind of status of the social sciences. There's been so much development and so much scholarship and research done. And also, let's remember, is that the societies that he's attempting to explain, and this is something that's very important to think about, the relationship between theory and history, and why, also, when it comes to Marx, is that as like capitalism changes, is that there may be insights that stem from, analysis that Marx had in the, second half of the 19th century, but that as it developed and changed, theory has to, of course, be revised in relation to the new forms that unfold, because it is dialectical. It is a historical process. And, theory is in relation to the history of its time. And likewise, the theory that he develops is, of course, very much based on, tribal groupings in North Africa and the kinds of city culture and civilization that developed in, what we could think of as the Islamicate world and the Mediterranean of his age, 14th and early 15th century. So he has a lot of deep insights, but it's more the methodological question of trying to think about the relationship, how to explain how do you have causation in history, and how do you understand and make human society the object of a kind of analytical study that applies reason to understand how it works. That's, I think, a very deep and important insight that we take now for granted, but I think was an important new direction at the time. So it's really more that method of trying to think through how to understand history, how to understand society in a scientific sort of perspective. I mean, he's very conscious of doing that, not only as a prolegomena to how you evaluate historical reports and tell what's true and what's not true in history, but also, just to, make society the object of study. And so he's very conscious of trying to make the case for that and engage Aristotle and, as a kind of the founder in some ways of the form of philosophy that, was his tradition, and show that history could be studied in this kind of scientific or philosophical way, as having regular principles of explanation beyond just the retelling of particularities. In other words, history wasn't just for moral edification of previous examples or entertainment, right? I mean, these are the kind of ways in which it could have been seen. And I think that's how somebody like Aristotle saw it, as not contributing to a substantive philosophical knowledge. And he tries to develop a way of thinking about human society in a very serious way.
Excellent. So I know that you have a meeting that you have to get ready for relatively soon. So let me just open the floor for you. Is there anything else that you want to say or have the audience know about Ibn Khaldun or his thought, things that you want to direct the listeners to in terms of further reading if they're interested? Anything that you want to say, Adnan? Now is the time.
Sure. Well, I mean, I just, I hope people found it interesting that there is a 14th century Muslim figure who really was thinking about things in this way. And it tells us that in the pre-modern period, it wasn't that people, weren't really interesting and intelligent. It's just, of course, the world that they were dealing with was quite different from our own. So gaps between what we would see as his form of thinking and explanation and our own in, kind of late modern, capitalism in the 21st century, there are going to be differences. And it's not as if reading him is like looking at, Emil Durkheim or Max Weber or, anything like that. But you can see roots and foundations of a kind of critical analysis of one's own society. That's what we're all trying to do. That's what we need to do. And he can be at least an inspiration in that. If people are interested, his work has been translated into English. I wouldn't recommend the 3-volume full edition of the Muqaddimah. That's pretty long, but there is a good single-volume excerpted digest of some of his ideas. And if you want to understand something about 14th century Muslim societies in the greater Mediterranean world, he's not a bad place to start. And he's just a very interesting and fruitful, a fruitful figure to think with if you're interested in earlier history and in thinking about how you relate historical change to social structure. I think people might find it interesting.
Well, I really enjoyed the conversation. I learned quite a bit. I was a bit hesitant to, hit record, not having done really any background research for this, because like I said, we only planned to do this about 10 minutes before we hit record. But I really did learn a lot, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you for teaching me, Adnan, and I'm sure the listeners are also saying the same thing right now. How can the listeners find you and the other excellent work that you do on your own podcast, which I pitched on the last episode, and I'm going to pitch again right now because the listeners really do need to check out the Majlis.
I heard that, and I really appreciate it. It was definitely an episode that was connected with the topic last time about the French elections and Islamo-Gauchism. So do check that out on the Majlis, Majlis. That's available on all your podcast platforms, and we have a recent episode with Juan Cole about peace movements in Islam, a recent book that he edited, and he talks about his contributions and those of others. And also, of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Adnan A. Husain, Husain.
Yeah, and the episode with Juan Cole, as all of the conversations that you, and I think I also had one with Professor Cole, has been excellent. So it was a great episode. Listeners should definitely check that out. And I do want to mention, well, I can see your face that, because I mentioned this on the last episode, but you weren't here. When you look for the Majlis, listeners, do not pick the one by Radio Free Central Asia.
Oh, yes.
Do not pick the CIA-funded podcast about Central Asia. Pick the one by our own Professor Adnan Husain, which I believe if you look at the author, it's by MSGPQU. Yeah. Yes, so if you just don't pick the right one. Okay. That's all I'm going to say. For our other co-host who's not here today, I will do the pitch. So our other co-host is Breht O'Shea, who is host of Rev Left Radio and co-host of the Red Menace podcast. You can find all of his work on revolutionaryleftradio.com. We will be recording with him again very, very soon. And the next episode that we have out will be one that Rev Left listeners will really enjoy, I think. And I know, Adnan, you and I are both Rev Left listeners, and so it's something that we're excited to talk about. As for me, listeners, you can find me on Twitter at Huck1995, HUCK1995. You can follow the show on Twitter at gorilla_pod, GUERRILLA_pod. And you can support the show, keep the lights on at Guerrilla History by supporting us at patreon.com/Guerrilla History, GUERRILLA. And I will mention that because I don't think that I remembered to mention this when we set it up. On our Patreon, we set up some annual membership discount thing. So if you pay for a full year's membership on the Patreon, you get, I think, a 10% discount. So you get like just over a month for free, basically, if you sign up for the full year up front, which, yeah, they gave us the option. So we figured, why not? It'll save you money, and it'll get some money in our pockets as well, such as it is. So until next time, listeners, solidarity.